For 6 decades, the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland in California has been a beloved icon. To this day, it still pioneers the best in special effects show elements. Trust me, this attraction and its history stands out from its more visited counterpart in Florida. The history of this beloved attraction begins in 1951, when Walt Disney and his team were drawing up ideas for Disneyland. Walt expressed his wish to have some kind of haunted house. Imagineer Harper Goff soon drew renderings of a church, graveyard, and haunted house for the 11-acre Mickey Mouse Park they were planning. However, after the purchase of the property in Anaheim, Imagineers brainstormed ideas for Main Street, USA. One idea predates the unbuilt Edison Square and Liberty Street. It was a small road that was an offshoot of Main Street lined with Victorian houses, and the street dead-ended with a rundown haunted house. Plans for the haunted house were put on hold during Disneyland's construction due to the fact that Disneyland was exceeding its budget. But Walt had revisited the idea of doing a haunted house around the year 1957 as part of the master plan to expand Frontierland on the west side of the park. This new expansion would be themed to New Orleans. Walt assigned Imagineer Ken Anderson to design the haunted house, because Ken had the experience of making thrilling and frightening scenes, as proven with his work on the Fantasyland Dark Rides, Snow White's Scary Adventures, and Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. In 1958, Walt went public with the idea of adding a New Orleans addition to Disneyland, and it would have a wax museum and a haunted house. Walt had spoken to the BBC in London about how he wanted to build some kind of retirement home for all the homeless ghosts in the world. He said, "The nature of being a ghost is they have to perform, therefore they need an audience." Ken Anderson searched New England and the American South for inspiration on the look of the haunted home in Disneyland's New Orleans land, and he found photographs of the Shipley Lydecker House in Baltimore, Maryland. This was the house from which he drew his inspiration. Ken finally created a sketch of the ramshackle house in 1958, and Sam McKim turned the sketch into the now famous painting of the Haunted Mansion. Everyone loved the look of the house. The project they had been working on finally had a face. Except it was a face Walt didn't like. You have to understand, this was 1958. Disneyland was still trying to distance itself from other amusement parks, which featured run-down and dilapidated structures. Walt insisted Disneyland always look new and in pristine condition. And after only 3 years of trying to build its reputation, Walt was not going to have this ramshackle house mar the beauty of his park. Walt told the team that he liked the architectural style, however, he wants the mansion to look just as well kept as the rest of Disneyland. He then famously stated, "We'll take care of the outside and let the ghosts take care of the inside." And if you consider those words for a moment, they really make sense. Disneyland is providing this living space for these ghosts. It's only fitting that Disneyland keep the exterior of the house in the same condition it keeps itself in. During the design of the mansion's backstory in 1957, Ken Anderson came up with several storylines for the walkthrough attraction. One featured a sailor named Captain Gore, who was secretly the notorious pirate Black Bart, and he killed his wife when she discovered his true identity. Another iteration was that the mansion came straight from the Deep South and was brought in one piece to Disneyland. The mansion was then known for killing all of its inhabitants. There was even a more humorous and light-hearted version of the story that featured Walt Disney himself as the tour guide via recorded tape and projection effects. But I will not be delving into these backstories. Instead, I will focus on the history of the physical mansion itself. Walt had Yale Gracie and Rolly Crump team together to research and develop special effects to be used in the haunted house. Walt saw Yale as an out-of-the-box thinker, and he was known for his mastery in building models as well as tinkering around with illusions. Rolly had an affinity for magic and illusions himself, and he was well known at the studio for his fooling around with creating mobiles and propellers, creating kinetic sculptures and things that moved in any which way you could imagine. Yale and Rolly were able to learn from old-fashioned illusions and deconstruct them in order to create more visually complex special effects. These illusions were rather simple when their workings were revealed, but had you not peeked behind the curtain, you probably would have never guessed how it was done. Back then, the designers at WED were a close-knit group, a lot like family. They may not have always gotten along, but there was a sense of togetherness, teamwork, support, and most of all, a common goal of bringing Walt's dreams to reality. By the end of 1959, Yale and Rowley had staged a full-scale mock-up of the haunted house attraction. There were several scenes staged to take around 2 minutes each to complete the full illusion or effect. Again, this was a guided walkthrough tour. Your tour guide would bring you from room to room where each staged scene would come to life. When Walt got a good look at the mock-up, he was impressed with the illusions they created. Unfortunately, he still wasn't sold on a walkthrough tour. It wasn't efficient enough to entertain the kinds of crowds that Disneyland received. And on top of that, the Imagineering team put in charge of the project could never pinpoint a definite storyline to the attraction, so the haunted house was put on indefinite hold. In 1961, plans to finally build New Orleans Square were being pushed forward, and work began on clearing out the area of Frontierland, known as Magnolia Park, home to the Chicken Plantation restaurant. Due to the larger design of New Orleans Square, the haunted house was given a plot of land further north than originally expected. Now it would reside near Fowler's Harbor along the rivers of America. Due to the fact that New Orleans Square would house a large wax museum themed to pirates and the Spanish Main, as well as a simultaneous expansion of the Jungle Cruise, this meant the boundary of the park would need to be extended and the Disneyland Railroad rerouted. The Frontierland Railroad Depot was moved about 100 feet further to the west, and a new station platform was built to handle a larger amount of people waiting for the popular trains. While the Pirate Wax Museum building would be hidden from view by disguising it as part of the shops and restaurants of New Orleans Square, there was no way to build the haunted house's show building within the park without shattering the illusion that people entering the little mansion were actually led into the massive warehouse behind it. So it was decided the Disneyland Railroad would pass through a tunnel between the mansion and its show building, providing the house with a large hillside behind it to hide views of the warehouse. In 1962, construction on the facade of the haunted house began, and it would be completed by 1963. During this time, Walt Disney was curious to see what show elements Imagineers could come up with for the haunted house. He asked a group of Imagineers such as Ken Anderson, Mark Davis, Claude Coates, Rolly Crump, and several others to start coming up with designs and ideas for him to brood over. Rolly had created several weird show elements. Walt and Rolly would later decide that the room that contained his weird artifacts would be called
Museum of the Weird.
Museum of the Weird.
When 1963 came about, the only thing that was completed was the mansion facade. Its show building and even the rest of New Orleans Square were put on hold as WED was busy at work designing attractions for the 1964 New York World's Fair. Newly recruited Imagineer Marty Sklar created a sign out front of the mansion advertising leasing for ghosts and restless spirits who wished to reside in the house. The World's Fair was a big leap for WED. Walt saw the potential for ride and show experimentation and expanding their library of knowledge, so he sent almost everyone he had at WED to work on 4 attractions for the World's Fair. Using the money corporate sponsors had given to WED to design these attractions, they were able to develop new ride technology. Though Ford's Magic Skyway would have a direct effect on the design of the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. It was an attraction where guests boarded real Ford convertibles that traveled back in time to the age of the dinosaurs, and then made their way through the history of mankind's technology. Imagineer Bob Gurr was tasked with figuring out how to get the Ford cars to drive through a show building in a safe and predictable way. What he came up with was using tubular steel rails underneath the roadbed that would guide and steer the vehicles through the building, and embedded in the roadway every few feet was a powerful electric motor fitted with a rubber tire, which would propel the vehicles forward at a controlled speed. This type of ride system would be forever known as the People Mover. So, when WED came back from their work at the World's Fair, Walt had to decide whether or not the haunted house would be a walkthrough or a ride-through. Some argue that they could increase the capacity of the haunted house walkthrough by creating an identical walkthrough in the same building, so that it could double the capacity. But even still, Walt was not convinced. The plans for the redo of Tomorrowland would call for several high-capacity attractions installed, such as the massive rotating theater of the Carousel of Progress, the Tomorrowland People Mover, which would chow through an astounding 3,000 riders per hour, and finally, a redesign of the People Mover, which would be called the Omni Mover, used for the Atom-mobiles of adventure through inner space. Walt called these high-capacity rides People Eaters because of their ability to consume the crowds that would otherwise be queuing up outside. The untimely and devastating death of Walt Disney in December of 1966 left Imagineers without a guiding force to keep the Haunted Mansion on track. There were so many different directions for them to go, and nothing had yet been given the green light by Walt. It was apparent that Imagineers would have to decide things for themselves, a predicament which led to divisiveness at WED. In 1967, Richard Irvine, who was in charge of WED, decided that with the massive success of Pirates of the Caribbean, that he would put Mark Davis and Claude Coates in charge of the Haunted Mansion, hoping the duo would create another smashing success. But Claude Coates felt that Pirates of the Caribbean was successful because of the scenery and sets he created, while Mark Davis thought the secret to its victory was the design of his pirate characters. This would lead to a feud where Claude thought the Haunted Mansion should be frightening and use its sets and place setting to develop that fear. But Mark felt that the house should draw inspiration from the hilarity of Pirates of the Caribbean by creating lighthearted and comedic ghost characters. But there was one thing Mark Davis and Claude Coates both agreed on. Now that Walt wasn't here to intervene, they would not allow Rolly's Museum of the Weird to be built. Rolly Crump was dismayed at the news of his project being cancelled. He would later say that for him, the Museum of the Weird was the one that got away. However, Rolly Crump held no grudge against Mark or Claude. You see, without Walt Disney there to provide his guidance, Richard Irvine and everyone at WED felt like they should leave the Haunted Mansion in the hands of the two guys who knew best how to translate Walt's dreams into reality. Everyone trusted Mark and Claude, and if they said the Museum of the Weird was not a good idea, then perhaps they were right. Nevertheless, Rolly's Museum of the Weird would have been a sight to behold. As development on the Haunted Mansion continued, Park Operations Manager Dick Nunes had been checking in on all the projects happening at Disneyland. He was the one that insisted to Walt that the Pirates Wax Museum should be turned into a high-capacity boat ride. He was also the one that eyed the progress of New Tomorrowland and made sure Imagineers knew that the park needed more people-eating rides. Imagineer Exitencio joked, "We called him Hop-Along Capacity." Dick Nunes was also against the Haunted Mansion being a walkthrough, even though it would be a guided tour to keep people from staying in one place too long, and even though there would be a duplicate experience to double the hourly capacity. He still felt this wasn't enough. He suggested that the mansion might benefit from the Omnimover technology used in Adventure Through Inner Space. When Adventure Through Inner Space was being developed, Imagineer John Hench was put in charge of the project, and he consulted with fellow Imagineer Bob Gurr on what type of ride system they could use to take people through the attraction. Bob was sitting at Hench's desk twirling a candied apple by its stem while he thought. It suddenly occurred to him when he looked at the apple twirling that they could use the People Mover ride system to create an endless chain of vehicles, but instead of vehicles that always faced forward, the Atomobiles would have the ability to rotate their pods 360 degrees in order to direct the guest's view at exactly what Imagineers wanted you to look at, when they wanted you to look at it. For the Haunted Mansion, they would duplicate the clamshell-shaped Omnimover system, then simply paint it black and dub them Doom Buggies. One very interesting technological aspect that Ford's Magic Skyway, the People Mover, the Atomobiles, and even the Doom Buggies share is their audio system. We take for granted how the ghost host's narration is delivered to us in each Doom Buggy at precisely the right moment. The system developed at the New York World's Fair is still in use at the Haunted Mansion today, albeit slightly upgraded. The whole chain of 130 Doom Buggies are divided into groups of 20 vehicles. In that string of 20 pods, the narration track is shared between a pair of vehicles, and the first Doom Buggy in that chain of 20 keeps the audio system powered using a dynamo that charges up a 12-volt motorcycle battery. So as the first buggy rolls along, it generates power. Now, each narration zone in the ride had a hidden antenna wire underneath the track that transmitted the narration, and each pair of Doom Buggies that passed by would pick up an individual narration track. The narration was broadcast in each area into 6 separate radio channels. That way 6 different pairs of Doom Buggies had the narration timed perfectly to the exhibit as they were passing through. Now today they use RFID scanners and chips to assign each pair of Doom Buggies a pre-programmed digital version of the narration. With the ride system chosen and the project in full force, Mark Davis and Claude Coates decided to compromise with their design differences. The whole ride experience would feature Mark's artwork, props, and characters placed in Claude's wonderfully crafted sets. As for whether the attraction would be funny or scary, They decided the first half of the experience would feature Claude's spine-chilling ambiance, but the second half would allow guests to leave the mansion with a light-hearted and cheerful mood. However, despite their compromises, neither of them could agree on a definite storyline for the ride, and so they simply omitted one, hoping the experience itself would carry the attraction. When Ex Atencio was brought in to write a script and song for the ride, he had a difficult task ahead of him. He was never a writer to begin with. Ex Atencio was an animator that Walt Disney brought over to WED during the development of Pirates of the Caribbean. It turned out that Ex had a talent for writing good lyrics and dialogue, and so he was the first person selected by Mark and Claude to write the show script for the mansion. When Ex had seen the plethora of randomness created by the team, he knew he had to find a way to tie it all in together. He remembered that Walt Disney had been advertising a place for ghosts to retire, and that Marty Sklar had created that sign that hung out front of the mansion for years at that point, hinting that ghosts could enjoy active retirement within. So Ex Atencio decided to write a script around the idea that the mansion was a retirement home. There had been ideas of having a host tour the guests through the scenes, and Ex had tried to write the host as a menacing raven, but he realized the bird was too small to be noticed easily among the large sets, so he rewrote the host to be disembodied. Lastly, he drew more inspiration from Pirates of the Caribbean with the idea that you leave the attraction on a high note, bouncing in your vehicle to a catchy tune. That's when he wrote the song Grim Grinning Ghosts, and partnered with studio composer Buddy Baker to create the music and song for the ride. It was decided that the ghost host would be narrated by voice actor Paul Frees, due to his uncanny ability to suddenly jump into character. After 10 years of development on a haunted house Walt Disney had wanted since 1951, the Haunted Mansion officially opened at Disneyland on August 12, 1969, 6 years after the completion of its stately facade on the hill, and at a cost of $7 million. But nevertheless, the Haunted Mansion was a great success, and it would solidify itself in history as one of the greatest Disneyland attractions ever built.
Welcome, foolish mortals, to the Haunted Mansion. All our ghosts have been dying to meet you.
Our tour begins here at the entrance. Ever since 1969, the queue always featured a winding path that came up to the front steps of the house and then veered off to the side of the manor. In the early 1970s, the south side of the mansion was expanded with a switchback queue and a mausoleum. The line would then continue behind the facade building and to the lawn on the north side of the mansion before returning to the main entrance steps. In the 1980s, Imagineers added a pet cemetery to this north lawn, but it wasn't long before the queue was permanently kept to the south side of the property, rendering the original pet cemetery abandoned. In 1993, it was duplicated to create a new pet cemetery on the way towards the switchbacks, and this is the pet cemetery we all know of today. However, the original cemetery still sits on that hidden north lawn just behind the ride exit. The biggest change came at the end of the year 2024, when the south end of the mansion property line was expanded to create a series of gardens. The entire queue was also constructed to be ADA compliant, so that guests using wheelchairs could wait in line with their friends and families instead of having to queue up near a small ramp at the front steps of the mansion. One last detail you may notice before entering the ride is a small hearse with an invisible horse harnessed to it. In the description below, I will put a link to a video that buries the biggest rumor of the hearse once and for all, but I'll try to summarize it as best I can. The hearse was purchased for Disneyland by Imagineer Bob Baranek for an Indiana Jones-themed stunt show in the year 1990. Though the stunt show never came to fruition, it was bought from a man named Dale Rickards of Malibu, who in turn purchased it in the 1970s from an eccentric collector, who claimed it was the hearse that carried Mormon prophet Brigham Young during his funeral. The hearse does date back to the Victorian era, but it turns out Brigham Young was carried by pallbearers, not by hearse. The hearse was added to the front of the Haunted Mansion in 1995 after extensive refurbishment, and it has been there since. As for the invisible horse hitched to it, well, that was Imagineer Tony Baxter's idea. Now follow me as we pass the boot scrapers by the front door and enter the mansion. Here is where we wait for our ghost host to begin the tour of the estate. The facade of the mansion itself is only large enough to fit the foyer, a hidden break room, and the 2 identical stretching rooms. The interesting thing about these galleries is that they act as a pre-show for the ride. It turns out this pre-show was installed as a necessity because in order to get park visitors to the large show building on the other side of the berm, you have to pass beneath the Disneyland Railroad tracks. This portrait gallery is actually the world's largest elevator and is designed to bring a large group of people downward. Interestingly enough, the hydraulic system it uses is not strong enough to lift a full room of 90 people back up, only 12. In order to disguise the elevator, it was decided to turn it into a haunted room that stretches before your very eyes. This was done by building the room into layers that can expand and retract like a telescope, lowering you 18.5 feet in total. Technically, you are only traveling 12.5 feet below ground because the mansion facade already sits 6 feet above normal ground level. Also, about the ceiling, it's actually made of theater scrim that looks solid when lit from the front, but when the lights go out and it's lit from behind, it becomes transparent. Before we leave the stretching room, I'd like to direct your attention to the portraits themselves. Each one was originally hand-painted by Mark Davis. They measure about 3 feet wide by 8 feet long. But would you be surprised if I told you that the paintings you see today look very different from the ones that debuted in 1969? That's because the portraits stretch and curl up hundreds of times a day. They eventually wear out and need to be replaced. But unfortunately, during the first decade of the Haunted Mansion's operation, photocopiers large enough to duplicate the portraits simply didn't exist. So every couple of years, the portraits had to be entirely repainted on new canvas by the hand of a different artist. The portraits we see today were likely painted in the 1980s and were immediately photocopied after they were finished. As a doorway suddenly appears, we are led into the portrait corridor. The walls used to be clad in antique Victorian-era wallpaper. It was purchased by Walt Disney himself, and he wanted it installed somewhere in the ride. It had a fuzzy texture in its design and was quite sturdy. Unfortunately, when the Haunted Mansion reopened after an extensive refurbishment in April of 2021, the Victorian wallpaper was replaced with a brand new pattern. At the end of the hallway are 2 busts that appear to follow you wherever you move. This effect was discovered by Rolly Crump and Yale Gracie when they had an inverted mask of Abraham Lincoln sitting on a table. When they walked past the backside of the mask, they were surprised by the astonishing illusion that Lincoln's eyes and head turned to follow them. These so-called busts are inverted in the same manner and lit from behind the wall with the light shining down, creating a very convincing effect. As for the changing portraits on the walls, they use a similar illusion to the ceiling of the stretching room, where they appear like normal paintings when lit from the front, because the ordinary image is silk-screened onto a theater scrim. The scrim is then stretched over a sheet of acrylic that has an alternate image on it. The front light used to gradually fade out, and a backlight behind the wall would illuminate the alternate image, which shined through the theater scrim. Today, these portraits changed with the synchronization of the lighting, but it still works the same way. As your doom buggies appear from the dark depths of the Great Void, you enter this cavernous room. Imagineers had left most of it empty and black to represent the dark abyss of the spirit world. This room is 40 feet tall from floor to ceiling, and the only comfort from the mysterious darkness is the soft, warm glow of the candlelight flicker, where the air is deathly still. Here, massive cobwebs are created by making a support structure from fishing line, and then they use a special cobweb gun developed by the Imagineers to dress up the fishing line with tendrils of dusty web. When the Haunted Mansion reopened in April of 2021, this queue area was updated with additional theming added to the wall near the guests. The new wallpaper extends into this area, and in the darkness, you can make out the shape of a massive door, and a glowing blue ghostly orb shines its light through the transom above. Next to the door is a new portrait. Well, it's not actually new. The April through December painting was in the portrait corridor until it was replaced in 2005. But now the picture is back, and as you walk past it, the woman slowly ages. Your doom buggies descend from the infinite beyond into the loading area, and you are encouraged to board up to 3 bodies per buggy. and as your carriage ascends the grand staircase into the abyss, the real chills begin. We come upon the first scene, an endless hallway with a floating candelabra swaying from side to side. This illusion is rather genius, as the hallway is about 50 feet long at most, but a full-size mirror is at the end, reflecting the length of the hallway. You can't see the reflection of the candelabra because the backside is painted black. There is also theater scrim in front of the candelabra to give the hallway a misty effect, which also hides the reflection of the doom buggies as they pass. Another interesting thing about this scene is when the ghost host says,
"Every room has wall-to-wall creeps, and hot and cold running chills. Shh, listen."
His choice of words was such because this scene was originally going to have a ghost bride appearing occasionally in the hallway holding the floating candelabra. She would suddenly disappear, and a blast of refrigerated air would give you chills as you heard her footsteps walking past your buggy. As you pass by the conservatory on your right, you get your first glimpse of the raven that would have been your ghost host, as well as an undead casket occupant, voiced by Ex Atencio himself. Soon you glide away from the conservatory and into the corridor of doors, and by this point, you may have noticed the prevalence of a bluish-purple wallpaper that appears to be watching you. This wallpaper was developed by Tanya Norris, and in fact, it continues the theme of seeing faces in almost every inanimate object in the mansion, designed to give you the creeps. In 2021, an element from an original Mark Davis design finally made it into the mansion. It is a little vampire bat with glowing red eyes. At first, it was placed next to the endless hallway, but now sits along the corridor of doors. As you pass the spinning hand of a clock striking the 13th hour, you may have heard this safety spiel.
Playful spooks have interrupted our tour. Please remain seated in your doom buggy. We will proceed in just a moment.
That spiel was also the voice of show writer Ex Atencio. Some longtime fans of the mansion may remember when the ghost host narrated through this area, saying,
"Perhaps Madame Leota can establish contact. She has a remarkable head for materializing the disembodied."
This part of the narration existed up until 2 decades ago, when it was finally shut off to make the transition to the holiday overlay much faster by having one less area of narration to reprogram every year. As we enter the seance circle, we discover a supernatural psychic medium calling the spirits to send us a message from somewhere beyond. The psychic, named Madame Leota, can be seen with only her head encased in a crystal ball as it floats around the room. The origins of this special effect began when Yale Gracie experimented by projecting a face of actor Hans Conried on the bust of Beethoven. When Walt saw it, he approved of it immediately. The original version of this seance circle had Madame Leota's crystal ball sitting in the center of the table, with a film projector supplying the imagery onto a featureless face. They used the likeness of Imagineer Leota Toombs to play the psychic medium, but her voice was a little too soft to be used in the final effect. So they called upon actress Eleanor Audley, who was known for voicing both Lady Tremaine and Maleficent, to provide the voice for Madame Leota. The projector aimed at Leota left an annoying glare on the glass of the ball, and for many years Imagineers tried to remedy this. At first they tried adding more light glare to camouflage it. In the early 2000s, they tried projection mapping technology to allow Leota's ball to float around the room, helping disguise the source of the glare. But the large projection angle required to accomplish this left Leota's face looking a little pixelated. But with recent technology, a micro projector was placed inside the bust, and it projects onto a slightly transparent face, finally solving the issue. As we leave the seance circle, our doom buggies then pull onto a second-story balcony overlooking a grand hall and ballroom. We can see a hearse has crashed through the wall, allowing the spirits to funnel in from the boundless realm beyond. But while finally seeing the ghosts is rewarding to the riders, the baffling thing about this ballroom scene is the question it prompts us to ask. how was it done? After all, the ghosts are completely transparent and can disappear and reappear at random. Well, you may or may not have noticed the very large panes of 8-foot by 25-foot glass between you and the ballroom. These glass panels were brought into the park by helicopter and were installed by crane, and they're located in the middle of the building. If you wanted to get them out, it would have to be in shattered pieces. This whole room was considered the world's largest working Pepper's ghost effect, and the glass is necessary to make it work. Developed in the 1800s, the Pepper's ghost effect works by basically reflecting real objects or actors onto the glass. This gives them their transparent look and makes for a convincing ghost, especially if the object or actor is carefully placed on a separate stage or area of the stage. Here you can see that there are ghosts sitting in chairs. This is done by meticulously placing ghost animatronics in carefully calculated areas hidden from view. This means that the ghosts you see are located either on the level directly above or below your doom buggy. The Pepper's ghost effect can be a little confusing. When the dancers were installed and tested, Imagineers were dismayed to see that after all their hard work, the effect turned out backwards, as the women were leading the men into the dance, which can still be seen to this day. At the end of the ballroom, you can see a grand pipe organ being played by a ghost. This pipe organ was used in the movie 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It was brought to Disneyland in the 1950s for a Tomorrowland walkthrough themed to the movie. When the walkthrough closed to make way for the 1967 New Tomorrowland project, it was saved from destruction and placed here in the ballroom just 2 years later. And now we leave the ballroom and enter the attic. The attic's props have changed many times since 1969 because of constant theft during ride breakdowns or even stylistic changes during refurbishments. Previous versions of the bride in the attic were animatronics, some with their skin painted matte black. There even used to be pop-up ghosts who occasionally declared, "I do." A new version of the bride was introduced in 2006, and she was referred to as Constance Hatchaway. As you passed through the attic, you could see portraits of her marriage to several husbands, but in each one, the heads of the men suddenly disappeared as Constance looked on menacingly. Constance was a controversy. Some fans thought she appeared like a failed projection mapping effect, but in actuality, she was supposed to be a ghost inhabiting her old wedding dress as it sits on an antique mannequin. In early 2025, the bride scene was redone to feature a layered projection mapping effect on top of a slight three-dimensional form. Think of the effect as kind of a Constance version 2. Even the portraits of Constance and her husbands still remain in the attic, except that instead of their heads disappearing, it's their whole bodies. And now, fellow mortals, we exit the attic and find ourselves on a third-floor balcony with the Hatbox Ghost. In the early years of the Haunted Mansion, there had been a Hatbox Ghost whose head would disappear from his shoulders and reappear inside the glass hatbox, and this effect was synchronized with the beat of the bride's heart. However, it never worked well, and what's more, the removal of the Hatbox Ghost was permanent for many decades, leading people to believe it never existed in the first place. Added in 2015, the new Hatbox Ghost is a rather clever animatronic, combining traditional functions with newer projection effects, like the one in the latest version of Madame Leota. The face of the ghost uses a microprojector within his skull, but the whole head can drop into the cavity of his body in order to complete the illusion that his head disappears. Furthermore, his hat is on a separate support structure, which is designed to tilt left and right. When his head disappears, it suddenly reappears in the hatbox. This is done by projecting his face onto a curved mirror inside the hatbox. The doom buggies back away from the Hatbox Ghost, and we are suddenly falling gracefully off the roof and into the graveyard below. The graveyard scene is simply too large to create another Pepper's ghost effect, so it was decided the animatronics would have to look transparent, like ghosts. First, the AAs have no skin. Instead, the clear plastic forms that usually give the AA its shape were left as is. The clothing of the ghosts are made of varying materials, predominantly translucent vinyl. Due to the rather large amounts of simulated moonlight and blacklight, this room was too bright to be left as is because then riders could see the walls of the room, as well as the mechanical inner workings of the animatronics. So large scrims stretching from floor to ceiling were installed in this room between your doom buggy and the animatronics. This scrim provides the illusion of haze and preserves the illusions that would otherwise be revealed by the lights. And now we come upon the famous singing busts. They lead the vocals of the rousing ragtime rendition of Grim Grinning Ghosts. Contrary to popular belief, these busts are not the face or voices of the famous Mellow Men group founded by Thurl Ravenscroft. However, they are celebrity voices of their own. From left to right, the singers are Vern Rowe, Thurl Ravenscroft, Chuck Schroeder, Jay Meyer, and Bob Ebright. Walt Disney is not one of them. Together, the busts are known as the Phantom Five. In the graveyard, one of the crypts revealed a phantom floating in the darkness. In 2025, this was changed to the candelabra to help tie together the idea of the bride having been following you from the never-ending hallway to the attic, and now through the graveyard. Before we exit the graveyard and come to the conclusion of the attraction, I have to point out that most of the faces of the ghosts in this ride are duplicates of the faces used in Pirates of the Caribbean, in order to save on time and costs. As a matter of fact, the old woman in the rocking chair in the ballroom scene is almost an exact replica of the grandmother from the Carousel of Progress. And now, dear mortals, as you pass through the mausoleum under the watchful eye of the cawing raven for the last time, we are warned to beware of hitchhiking ghosts. As you pass in front of 3 large mirrors, you can see that one of the hitchhiking ghosts is tagging along. This is accomplished because the mirrors are not actually mirrors at all. Instead, they are just windows into a blacked out room where there used to be animatronic ghosts passing on a turntable moving at the same speed as the Doom Buggies. This wasn't originally intended to be this way. The idea was that you had no reflection, only the ghosts appeared to occupy your buggy. But during testing, the illusion never worked because no matter how they played with the light over the pods, people's reflection always appeared in the glass. During the 2025 refresh, the animatronic ghosts in the mirrors were replaced with very convincing projection effects. This unloading area takes you underneath the Disneyland Railroad for your return to the park. You ascend the ramp and see little Leota. This time, both her face and voice belong to Leota Toombs. The ramp only has to take you 12 feet up because the exit of the ride is 6 feet lower than the entrance. The Haunted Mansion has stolen our hearts and souls and sealed itself into a list of Disneyland classics that we've all grown to cherish and wish to protect. Disneyland in California wouldn't be the same without this attraction, nor would any modern ride special effect at any Disney park be able to accomplish the things they have without the developments that Rolly Crump and Yale Gracie perfected. Though Walt Disney never got to see the Haunted Mansion completed, his imaginative legacy lives on in the spooky corridors of this Disneyland classic. The sheer amount of detail and artistry that went into its production, spanning over 10 years of labor, shows in its convincing ability to transport you into the spirit realm. Gliding through these ghostly halls in your own dune buggy has become another enchanting facet of Disneyland.
Now, I will raise the safety bar, and a ghost will follow you home.